Hey guys, it's Al. Thanks for watching the channel. Thanks for all your likes, views, and subscribes. I appreciate them very much. You're helping make my dream come true. Today I'm going to introduce you to my real drum set. I always wanted a Ludwig professional kit when I was growing up, but they simply weren't available where I was, and they were always very expensive. Little did I know that later on I'd be given one by a twist of fate. So this is a Ludwig Standard, or kind of. I'll explain it a little bit. What happened was in the 60s and 70s, as Beatlemania swept the country and everybody wanted a Ludwig drum set, all of a sudden there were tons of knockoff, cheaply made import kits coming into the States and into Europe. And they were competing directly with Ludwig's very expensive USA-made drums. In order to cut costs, Ludwig decided to put different lugs and fittings on the 3-ply shells that they were known for. They gave them lighter hardware. They called them the Ludwig Standard. And they came with some really funky wraps. This was originally a blue strata wrap, and it's faded a lot, and I'll go over some of the damage that happened to it. Anyway, you may remember that I told you about the Ludwig Standard aluminum snare that I traded somebody for a piccolo. If you don't, here's that link right up here. Anyway, the music store where I made that trade, there was a guy named Lance, and he was there when I made this trade with this kid for this piccolo snare. And a few months later, he came to me and he said, "Hey, I know you love Ludwig drums and you just got that Ludwig Standard snare. I have a set to match it." It turns out that this guy had gotten in touch with Lance and given him this tom and this bass drum. But they looked like this. They'd been to the wars. Turned out this guy fished them out of a dumpster. The shells were in decent round shape, but they had all sorts of problems with them. All the bottom heads and rims and lugs were gone. Most of the heads were gone too. And the couple of heads that were left were in really bad shape. Everything was rusted, pitted, needed work. And the wrap had some problems too. There was a couple of places where it lifted and cracked, especially on the bass drum. And on the top of the bass drum, right here, somebody had spray painted it white. You can see it in this photo. So with all these missing parts, all these things wrong, there was a lot of work that had to go into these drums. The very first thing was to get the drums together, clean them up, and figure out what it was I was missing. So all the bottom heads and all the lugs were missing. The tom mount was missing. The tom arm was missing, but I did have a bass drum bracket. All the front lugs and the front hoop and the front head, kind of, for the bass drum were missing. The bass drum spurs were present, but they were, number one, those telescoping spurs. Number two, they were in really bad shape. And number three, one of the holes through the shell on the left-hand side had actually torn through, and there's a big gaping hole at the bottom of the bass drum. The bass drum head that was there was like an old single-ply Slingerland, and it was probably a front head at one time. And of course, then it was in pretty bad shape. 13-inch tom just had a power stroke on it, and it also was not playable. I mentioned that these things were dusty, dirty, and grimy. So of course, the first thing I needed to do was clean them up. So I wiped off all the rims with soapy water, and the same thing with the lugs. Most of the lugs had to be taken apart, cleaned inside, and I had to replace some of the lug nuts. I had to replace springs, and of course I had to pack them all with cotton because they were just in bad shape. Once I figured out what I was missing from these two drums, I needed to go ahead and start taking orders to, or Drum Factory Direct, I'm sorry, that is DFD. That's the website with all the parts. So I ordered a rim, a hoop, I ordered a whole bunch of little bits. The lugs, I actually went online a couple of places, a couple of eBay auctions, but for most of them, and for the bass drum T-rods I was missing, I actually went to Don Bennett's in Seattle, back when it was open, and had that huge spare parts department. A guy and I went through all of those bins, and we spent hours looking for standard lugs and for these T-rods and for at least passable claws. For the bass drum spurs, I decided I was just going to go ahead and get a pair of Gibraltar Gullwing spurs. They look vintage enough. I love them. They're very light. They do the job really well for this drum. For the tom, instead of buying or getting another shell mount, I decided to go ahead and do an Atlas mount. I love these things. They are fantastic. They really let the drum sing. One of the biggest problems, of course, with this setup so far, and it happens all the time, there was no floor tom. But I had a floor tom, and it was a Ludwig, and it was a 3-ply. The good news ends there. I bought this Ludwig used from a guy way back when I was a kid, and it had a huge hole knocked in the side. It was missing all its bottom hardware. And the red sparkle wrap that it had, he had painted over it with black spray paint. Like, he didn't remove the wrap and then paint the shell black. He just painted the wrap black. And of course, the drum was in terrible shape. The bearing edges were horrible. I had to sand the edges to get them playable again. And of course, while I was finding more standard lugs and rims at Bennett's and at Drum Factory Direct, I went ahead and ordered extra for the floor tom, ordered a set of just generic floor tom brackets for the legs. I already had the legs, but the brackets were in really bad shape, the original Ludwig brackets. Fortunately, I was able to order some generic brackets that just fit in the same holes. but we had that horrible wrap on it. Now what do? Well, first things first, I tore off that wrap. I just tore it off. So here you go. Here is the bare floor tom. I'm not going to play it like that, and of course it would get damaged if I did. I must have spent months looking for somebody online who could replicate a Blue Strata wrap like this. And in the end, I gave up because nobody could. Nobody had Blue Strata back in that time. Funny enough, a few years later, Ludwig reintroduced Blue Strata. Yay, too late. Anyway, so I had to make my own. So I took a whole bunch of photos and color samples from the two drums I had all around the shelves. Then I went in Photoshop, took some of those pictures, blew them up, spliced them together, spent a whole bunch of time painting the lines together and blending the colors until I had a life-size piece of wrap for that drum, which I then sent to Bum Wrap Drum Wrap Company, and their link's going to be down in the description. They just took that and printed it. That is a printed wrap, but if you look from here, other than the fact that it's slightly different colors, it looks fine. And from the stage, I very rarely, when I tell people that I designed that wrap and put it on, they're like, These drums are fantastic for almost everything I play. The bass drum is one of the best bass drums I've ever played. It's a 14x22, which means it's got that immediate attack, but it's still got lots of bass and boom in it. This drum got me back onto loving 22s. I had decided I was small, I'm a short guy, I'm just gonna play 20 inches, very versatile right now. I'm back on 22s with this. I might try 24. The rack tom, as you saw in the photos, for a long time I was mounting off of cymbal stands. But last year I realized that the cymbal stands were not working for me because it was a pain to maneuver around and always get in the right position. It added minutes on setup time, and when you're like me, when you just want to set up and get going, minutes are everything. So I actually bought an Atlas single tom mount. Sunk into the bass drum. I had to cut the down tube because the down tube was like this long, right? It's way too long. Ludwig, nobody needs one that long, okay? But I love it. It just does the job. I was worried that the heaviness of it would hurt the 3-ply shell, but no. Now this shell has all sorts of extra holes in it. Sorry collectors, it was always a player's kit, the condition I got. And then the floor tom, for all its dings and scrapes and problems, every time I think I'm just going to get a new floor tom and get a matching wrap and replace it, I listen to a recording of this one and it's just so full of bottom. I can't get rid of that thing. It's perfect. It sounds so good on recordings. It sounds so good live. It only sounds kind of weird behind the drum set, but I don't know. I think all floor toms do that. This is my go-to drum set for almost any live gig. The only time I won't play this is if I know I need a very, very small drum set, in which case I'll pull out my Yamaha Stage Custom shell pack and gin something up there. Or if I know that just for whatever reason they're not going to sound correct, maybe I need a more modern sound. Again, the Yamahas can do that. But for the big go-ahead rock sound, for the classic rock sound I did with my classic rock bands, for a lot of the indie rock that I do, And even for like the tuned down low jazz stuff and you know, the lighter music that I do, these are fantastic. They can go really, really low and thuddy, which fits in perfectly with harder rock and metal. Or I can tune them up a little bit, and then they're perfect for something jazzy. I love my Ludwigs, but sometimes I'm really torn about keeping them. And the reason I'm torn about keeping them is because I'm not a 1360 guy. You've seen in the other videos where I play a 12-14-16 on the church kit, which is over there. And that's the setup I'd rather have. But finding just a 12 and a 14 Ludwig Standard in these sizes is number one, hard, and number two, expensive. Number three, they often come bundled with a 20-inch bass drum, which I really don't need. I keep looking around to see if I find a 12 or a 14-inch orphan that can go with this kit. Even if I have to rewrap it, I would be willing to do that for a reasonable price. That's the other thing. I don't need to pay $600 for a 14-inch floor tom. So if you know where I can get a Blue Strata 12 or 14-inch tom, Ludwig Standard, or 3-ply for that matter, just drop it in the comments below, DM me, hook me up. I'd love to get this kit exactly where I want it, then I won't have to go buy another one, and my wife will thank you. Hey, I hope you really enjoyed this talk about my Ludwig Standards, my favorite drum set, even though I wish there were a few other things attached to it. But what do you think? What did you love about it? What would you change about it? How'd you like the job I did rehabbing it? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and enable your notifications. And thanks for watching Al's Drumhead.